To open this meeting of the Dante Society of America with its symposium dedicated to questions of translation, we had an embarrassment of choice for Dante translators to invite. There are so many translations of the comedy, for example, partial or complete, over 200 by my last count. Translations by Dante scholars, by lifelong teachers of Dante, by classicists, by public intellectuals, by Dante devotees, translations in terza rima, which no one has ever managed to make look effortless or successful, translations in blank verse, in prose, in free verse, in colloquial slang. The most tempting to me have always been the poets and artists who translate Dante, poets with a capital P, who share with Dante the impeño of organizing and reorganizing the universe through the intricate craft of difficult language bound with the bonds of music, of sound. Professor Mary Jo Bang is a poet with a capital P, who in 2012 published a daring translation of the Inferno. She describes it as a postmodern, intertextual, slightly slant translation in a spoken form of English that is rich with idiom and even occasional slang. We were thrilled that she accepted our invitation. I'll tell you just a little about her, and then I'll turn the floor over to her. Professor Bang holds a BA and MA in Sociology from Northwestern University, a BA in Photography from the Polytechnic of Central London, and an MFA in Creative Writing from Columbia University. She was the poetry co-editor at Boston Review from 1995 to 2005. She's been the recipient of a Hodder Fellowship from Princeton University, a grant from the Guggenheim Foundation, and a Berlin Prize Fellowship at the American Academy in Berlin. She's the author of 7 books of poems, the most recent of which is The Last 2 Seconds, Grey Wolf Press, 2015. Her 1997 Apology for Want was awarded the Bakeless Prize. Louise in Love, 2001, received the Poetry Society of America's Alice Faye di Castagnola Award for a manuscript in progress. Elegy, 2007, received the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her 2012 translation of Dante's Inferno was named a notable book by both the Academy of American Poets and by the American Library Association. It's an exhilarating, challenging, brilliant, and personal adaptation of Inferno. And I was going to read a short excerpt from it, but I know that she will be reading a bit for herself in her talk, and I'm going to skip right over that and get to her. Mary Jo Bang will speak to us on carrying Dante across. Please join me in welcoming her to Eugene.
I always feel like that's a gothic film when I creak. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Gina, and both to Gina and Warren for inviting me. I told Gina a few minutes ago that when I've told my friends that I'd been invited to the Dante Society, they would laugh because I'm just a poet, and they know it. But apparently Warren and Regina thought I was a translator and invited me on those grounds, and I am delighted to be at the largest Dante fan club in the world, and I only hope I get the decoder ring at the end. So if you were here a few minutes ago, you heard a sound piece that I was playing, which is a piece that was created by an avant-garde conceptual artist named Carolyn Bergvall, and Bergvall is a British poet. It was initially a text piece that first appeared in an experimental journal of poetry and poetics called Chain, which no longer exists. Such is the way with experimental journals of poetry and poetics. Later, the piece appeared in Bergvall's book, Fig, in 2005. I read it in 2006. The poem was accompanied by a note explaining the method of composition. In the year 2000, Bergvall went to the British Library to begin a project to mark the 700 years since the character Dante set out on his journal through the giant funnel that ends in a block of ice, where a 3-headed Lucifer As the poet Sylvia Plath would have it, eats men like air. Bergvall found 47 translations on the shelves of the library, including 2 new ones that were shelved during the time she worked there. What she eventually settled on for her project was to take the first 3 lines of each English translation, arrange them alphabetically by the first word, and append to each the translator's last name and year of publication. She titled the finished piece Via, 48 Dante Variations. The Via gestures to the fact that the translations she collated are the ways and means by which the Inferno stays alive in the English-speaking world. The 48th variation is her own piece, which now brings the 47 together in the form of a text collage. Atop the 47 translations are the original 3 Italian lines. And I was going to ask, Gina, do you have the handout with the lines, or do you know them by heart? Could you, say them in Italian? My Italian doesn't exist. Yes, please. So, yes.
Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita.
Gracias. So those 3 lines are at the top, and they're followed by the first 3 lines of each translation. Reading Via for the first time in June 2006, what struck me was the difference between the translations, even those, I'm out of order. Sorry, forget I just said that last sentence. The alphabetic arrangement of the translations privileges letters, the building blocks of language, instead of time, which is appropriate since any translation once in the world theoretically becomes timeless. Bergvall's methodology gives us an odd chronology where Dante Gabriele Rossetti's 1865 translation, number 11, the first of that on your handout, is just 1 step away from number 13, Armand Schwerner's 2000 posthumous version. He died in 1999. In between the two is an 1867 translation by David Johnston, about whom I can tell you nothing, because he sadly has no Wikipedia page. For a moment, I'd like us to take a look at these tercets, 11 through 15, beginning with Rossetti's. In midway of the journey of our life, I found myself within a darkling wood, because the rightful path had been lost. Rossetti, 1865. In our life's journey, at its midway stage, I found myself within a wood obscure, where the right path which guided me was lost. Johnston, 1867. In the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark forest, the straightforward way, misplaced. Schwerner, 2000. In the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight road was lost. In the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself within a dark wood, where the straight road was lost. Sinclair, 1939. Reading Via for the first time in June 2006, what struck me was the difference between the translations, even those within the same era. The Italian seemed fairly straightforward, and yet clearly it wasn't. For De Rita, we have, in just these 5 stanzas, rightful pathway, the right path, the straightforward way, the straight road, the straight road. If you look at the 47 tercets carefully, you will see that sometimes translators seem to stand on the shoulders of those who came before them. Durling's, I do need that. We were going to show the poem online, and instead we had to choose sound. So how's that going to work? You won't see it. You'll have to listen then to me. Not that you wouldn't be. Durling is very close to Sinclair's, and Johnston seems to be following Rossetti. What was also clear to me, however, was that time itself, that was that time itself and the changes that happened to any language over time didn't necessarily play the role I would have expected. So going back, I guess you do have that on your handout. So you look at Durling's In the Middle of the Journey of Our Life, Sinclair, In the Middle of the Journey of Our Life, Durling, I Came to Myself in a Dark Wood, Sinclair, I Came to Myself Within a Dark Wood, and then For the Straight Road Was Lost, Where the Straight Road Was Lost. Or with the Rossetti and the Johnston, In the Midway of the Journey of Our Life, In Our Life's Journey at its Midway Stage, I Found Myself Within a Darkling Wood, I Found Myself Within a Wood Obscure, Because the Rightful Path Had Been Lost, Where the Right Path which guided me was lost. Further, looking at Foster's 1961 version, midway along the span of our life's road, I woke to a dark wood unfathomable, where not a vestige of the right way showed. Now, that showed is spelled S-H-E-W-E-D, and you might not even know that it should be pronounced showed, except it has to rhyme with road in the first line. You can see that he's used an antiquated variant of showed and the extremely odd not a vestige of the right way, as well as the odd syntax of a dark wood unfathomable. Chardy, the next after Foster, 35 years later, in 1996, midway in our life's journey, I went astray from the straight road and woke to find myself alone in a dark wood. And that and is an ampersand. Chardy has inserted an outdated but highly poetic ampersand, which, as you know, didn't originally indicate a simple and, but was the letterpress printer's shorthand for and, etc. Chardy's I Went Astray also seems slightly elevated in tone, and he additionally has tampered with the order in which events are revealed. I went astray and then woke in the wood, instead of I found myself in a wood and afterwards noted the lost path. Schwerner's choice of misplaced for lost is an interesting substitution, since it essentially turns the path into something like a pair of reading glasses that someone might find again if only they looked carefully enough. I could see that translators who adhered to the terza rima form, both in the present and in the past, were forced into odd turns of phrase, like number 34, Willstack of 1888. And I should mention that John Augustine Willstack is another translator who, for all of his effort, pentameter, rhyming pentameter, no less, today lacks so much as a Wikipedia page, too. Such is rhyming pentameter. I was fascinated. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found me in a forest dark and deep, for I the path direct had failed to keep. I was fascinated by all of these things. What I also became aware of as I read the variations over and over was how the language was often undermining the subjectivity. It was also evening out the emphasis over the three lines. I was lost, I was in a dark forest, I couldn't find the road. If you've ever been lost, literally and especially figuratively, there's a sense of horror and panic. The next lines of the canto, as you know, detail that sense, describing how terrifying the forest is when one is lost in it, how the speaker can now barely look back because he inevitably re-experiences the trauma, and he notes how that state can't possibly be worse than death itself. Of course, I didn't have the rest of the canto in front of me, and yet I intuited from the word lost a mindset that I wasn't sensing in many of these translations. Not all of the translations use the word lost, and Chardy's strayed is a reasonable translation of the word, although, as I said, it's more elevated. And in poetry, tone and register communicate feeling states. Sound does as well. If we look at the sounds in the original three lines, and I've messed with that so that it's easier for you to see, you can see the complexity and entanglement of the situation is actually enacted. So we have 3 L sounds, nel, del, cel. We have 4 long O's, mezzo, nostra, and forgive my pronunciation, please, ritrovai, oscura. 9 long E's, camin, di, vita, mi, ritrovai, di, rita, via, smarrita. 12 short A's, ca, nostra, vita, una, selva, oscura, la, dirita, via, era, smarrita. And 2 ER sounds, which I think I didn't mark when I made the handout, but the per and era. So these 3 lines are bound together in the original, not just by unrelenting end rhyme, but the ear is actually caught in a dense forest of sound, with one moment that stands out by its lack of echoes. Mi, ri, tro, vi. I found myself again, or I wound up. Not trovi, but retrovai. Nobody was saying again in the translations. And that forest itself, una selva oscura. Over the 47 translations, we have 17 uses of dark wood as the English equivalent, but we also have several uses of gloomy wood, several elevated dark some and dark ling wood, a shadowed wood, another shadowy wood, several times a forest dark, another forest in darkness, one a wood so drear, a gloom dark wood, a dark wood unfathomable, Foster again, what was he thinking? A dusky wood, a sunless wood, a night dark wood, a wood obscure, and a great forest. Reading over these translations and thinking about the choices each translator had made, I realized as a poet that each of these word combinations reads differently in terms of sound and register, and that ultimately sound and register affect the subjectivity created by the language. So each choice has a different effect. The more archaic formulations argue to the reader that this is a very old poem, a poem not of the contemporary era, and that is true. The poem was written long ago, as you know, probably 1306. But many of the words and word combinations also seem to argue that this was a rarefied poem, and rarefication has the potential of creating a sense of great remove in poetry. It argues that the poem is not only not written in the present era, but it has nothing to offer the reader who's located in the present. It's a quaint literary artifact of a long ago time and interesting to those who are interested in literary history and can place this poem in a larger context. And as you know, that is not the case with the Inferno. It is much more than a literary artifact. I had taken some poetry workshops when I was an MFA student in poetry at Columbia. The first workshop was rather unremarkable, but the second one was with the famous Italian English translator, American translator, William Weaver, best known for his translations of Umberto Eco, Primo Levi, and Italo Calvino. In both classes, I worked on translating from the French. The workshop with Weaver was memorable for many reasons, not the least of which was because on the first day he brought in Xerox copies of the first few pages of 3 translations of Cervantes' Don Quixote, first published in Spain in 1605. The first translation was by Thomas Shelton, done in 1611, only 7 years after the book's initial publication. The second, by Tobias Smollett, was published in 1755. The third was Magda Bogen's 1991 illustrated translation/adaptation, published in a hardcover edition by Abrams, the highly respected art publisher. Looking at these 3 translations, I could see that the language of each appeared to be more or less a match for the language of its era. The Shelton spoke in the voice of the early 17th century. Notation, chapter 1, followed by a prefacing statement that sits above the text, quote, wherein is rehearsed the calling and exercise of the renowned gentleman Don Quixote of the Mancha. The work proper begins with the convention of a large illustrated capital T followed by the all cap HERE. There lived not long since in a certain village of the Mancha, the name whereof I purposefully omit, a yeoman of their calling that used to pile up in their halls old lances, halberds, morions, and such other armors and weapons. He was beside master of an ancient target, a lean stallion, and a swift greyhound. And all of the spellings are quite antiquated. The same sentence in the Smollett, almost 150 years later, went like this. Chapter 1, then, of the quality and amusements of the renowned Don Quixote de la Mancha, followed by, in a certain corner of La Mancha, the name of which I do not choose to remember, there lately lived one of those country gentlemen who adorn their halls with a rusty lance and well worm-eaten target, and ride forth on the skeleton of a horse to course with a sort of starved greyhound. And Bogan's 1991 version jumps right in, no prefacing statement, with once upon a time, in a village of La Mancha, there lived a certain gentleman whose lance was always at the ready. He also kept an ancient shield, a scrawny horse, and a greyhound for the chase. I have to admit at the time, I don't know that I understood that Bogan's was an adaptation/translation. Regardless, I think from that class, I wrongly thought that translations of long ago texts keep pace with time, at least somewhat. Even Chaucer's tales were not in Old English, although the original was, of course, there for those who would do the work of learning the language. It made sense to me that translations would change over time. What was the point of using thou'st canst when you can would work equally well? And yet, looking at the 47 translations of the first 3 lines of Dante's Inferno, as Bergvall had arranged them, it was clear that no one seemed interested in dropping the level of the diction. I wondered, wouldn't it be possible to choose language that was close enough to the language of today to not continually announce the fact that the poem was so distant in time? The back cover of the book would tell you the poem was from the early 1300s. As it was, the diction was not only saying that the poem had been written long ago, but was suggesting that one might need a rarefied sensibility in order to enjoy it. The version of Dante's Inferno I first owned was Charles S. Singleton's, published in 1970 by Princeton University Press. The bilingual prose translation was in 1 volume, and there was a second, quite substantial volume of commentary. I only say that because there might be people who are not members of the Dante Society present, but I feel like I should preface everything I say, as you know, but that'll get tedious. So just understand, I'm not talking down to the fan club. So, substantial volume of commentary. I bought both volumes used at the Book Ark, a basement-level used bookstore on 81st Street, just off Amsterdam Avenue in New York City in 1994. The store was run by 2 very erudite booksellers and advertised itself as having a special interest in rare books, academic books, especially philosophy, visual arts, and foreign titles in French, German, and Spanish. The shelves were continually changing, and I was stocking up on reading material for the rest of my life. I wasn't a poet yet, but I was learning to be one, and I was making up for lost time. Maybe a year after I bought the translation, a friend in the MFA program and I were commiserating about how many of the great books we had never read. I mentioned the Inferno, and he said, yes, and let's read it together. It turned out we both owned translations, but hadn't yet read them. He owned the Carlyle Oakey Wicksteed, done in 1849, but published in 1932 in a modern library edition, and he said he bought that one because he liked the blue cover. I said I owned the Singleton, but I would buy the Wicksteed, and he insisted no, we would each read from the translation we had. It would be interesting, he said. I was a bit confused by that. How would we follow along? But in the end, of course, I saw how brilliant that was. For months, he would come over in the evening and we would sit on the floor of my apartment, taking turns reading a canto from our respective translations. The other would follow along in the second translation, and afterward, we would talk about the differences, sometimes preferring one, sometimes another. Each version would also have different notes, and we would read through those and discuss them. We read the entire Inferno that way, and then Purgatorio. I'm embarrassed to say we began Paradiso and stopped. It was a little boring. Inferno was the one we loved best. It was an amazing experience reading that way over months, taking the time to consider the translation as translation, to see the difference in music and meaning, to share the experience with someone who is as brilliant as my friend Timothy Donnelly, a poet in his own right, is. So there, some 10 years later, sitting alone in my living room, and it being June, when academics are free to make mischief, and reading Bergvall's piece several times and having the thoughts I've just shared, why was everyone continuing to pitch the tone so high? Why were people insisting on the terza rima form, which was clearly compromising in the English, since we have so many fewer rhyming words, as you know? Why was no one capturing the pathos of the situation? So it occurred to me that if there were this many translations of the Dante, and Bergvall's note said there were over 200, and by all people who thought they were being absolutely faithful to the original, wouldn't someone now be free to translate the work with some abandon, especially if it was just a game someone was playing on a summer day? I first had to decide whether I was going to keep the tercet. Yes, I thought, that's what Dante did, and it's a signifier of poetry. And Dante wrote a poem, not prose, and I'm a poet, so yes to the tercet. Then I had to decide about rhyme, and especially terza rima. Rhyme in contemporary poetry is tricky. If it's too regular, it can have a nursery rhyme quality, and worse, it can have a comic effect, like Celery by Ogden Nash. Celery, raw, develops the jaw, but celery, stewed, is more quietly chewed. I wanted sound patterning because sound has expressive potential, and it creates sonic momentum, and it makes music and rhythm. But I wanted a more contemporary sound than regular end rhyme. I thought about how contemporary poetry primarily relies on alliteration, assonance, and internal rhyme, so I would use that. I then set out to translate the 3 lines using the 47 previous translations as my Virgils. I had fun. So much fun, in fact, that I began to wonder what I might do with the next 3. I went to my bookshelf and pulled down the Singleton. I did the next 3, then the next. I was still having fun, but suddenly I realized I was letting Singleton set the parameters, whereas before I'd had 47. Now I was bound by one translator's decisions. So, since it wasn't lunchtime yet, I got in my car and went over to the university library and brought home 12 translations of the Inferno. I had Longfellow's 1867 translation and Robert and Jean Hollander's 2000, the most recent one in our library at that time, and 10 others in between. From time to time over the summer, I'd sit down and do 3 more lines. By the end of August, I had done the entire first canto. By that time, I was hooked. I decided to do the entire Inferno, but I would take my time. There was no hurry, I thought. It could take years, a lifetime even. I was only doing it for the fun of it. At some point, something changed. You know how when somebody gets into a rule-breaking mood, sometimes that person can go too far? I may have gone too far. I'm embarrassed to admit there was a Freudian finger puppet in the canto, and at one point I had Dante saying, "Geez, Miss Louise." I couldn't see the error of my ways yet. Fortunately, I did later. But at this time, I was hoping that a reader would just enjoy the irreverence and the sound play. I used that crazy canto as the basis of an application for a fellowship to the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center in Italy with a proposal to do more of the same kind of translation. And due to some miracle, I was given the fellowship. I now purchased additional translations and sent those and the library books in advance of my arrival to the villa, where I would spend a month. I was given a sleeping room and a workroom with a huge table, around which I arranged the translations, each one open. I would walk around the table reading over and over the various ways that translators had expressed the Italian of the original. In addition, there was a library in the villa and an enormous, unabridged Italian-English dictionary. I asked permission and was given it and took the dictionary into my workshop. Now I not only interrogated how each translator read the word, but what the dictionary had to say about that word. At some point, I also discovered a text online through Google Books, a prose translation done in 1888 and revised in 1903 by William Warren Vernon, titled Readings on the Inferno of Dante, based on the commentary of Benvenuto da Imola and other authorities. The Benvenuto commentary was completed in 1377. The dictionary made me serious about the translation. I wasn't just trying to shake up a staid lineage. I now wanted to join that lineage. Over the next 5 years, I devoted myself to making a translation that had rigor beneath its worked rhetorical surface. I explored all the ways I might bring the poem over into the present. I studied translation theory. I talked to translators. Most were encouraging, some were not. For those who questioned what I was doing, I was equally grateful in the end, because I had to develop a rationale for doing whatever I was doing, and I had to think through my decisions. What I want to do now is, because you've been hearing me talk about what I did, you can't know it until you hear some of it. So this is a good time to read a canto for you. And I've chosen Canto 3. It's my favorite canto. And as most of you know, it is after Dante has come to himself in a dark wood and found that the straight way is lost. He meets Virgil, the Roman poet, and Virgil says, in order to get out, you've got to go further in, and I'll take you. And after some equivocation, Dante agrees to go. And at the beginning of Canto 3, they find themselves at the door to the Inferno, and they'll come in and find themselves in a foyer, more or less. Canto 3. Welcome to the city of woe. Welcome to everlasting sadness. Welcome to the grave cave. Justice made the maker build it just like this, with primitive love and bricks of wisdom. If being is power, power created it, i.e., it is. Before this, there was nothing that wasn't eternal, and after, nothing but the eternal. You, who have no hope, enter here. These words in soot and all in caps, as if by a hurried hand, were scrawled on the stone overhead above a creaking door. Sir, I said, this is harsh. He spoke like an expert nephew to a drunkard uncle. Now you need to leave behind your fear. Now you need to kill your cowardice. We're where I said we'd come to, the place where you'd see the wretched dead who have lost the aid of their intellect. He touched my hand as if to tell me all would be all right. Then we crossed over from where we'd been into the inner sanctum that houses hidden things. The starless air was echoing with countless sighs, horrific cries, extended loud laments. I was in tears as I listened, the angry accents, the strident utterances, the striking hands, the near-deafening chorus of 1,000,000 dolls' dark inner voices crying, "Mama, Mama, Mama," veered off walls and swirled around and around like sand in a storm, becomes one with the wind that carries it. And I, circled by horror, said, "Sir, what am I hearing? Who are these people so overcome by grief?" He said, "This is the inheritance of the contemptible, who did nothing wrong but nothing right. They blend together with that band of vile angels who didn't rebel, but who also didn't stand with God, but only for themselves in selfishness. To preserve its beauty, heaven threw them out. Deep as hell doesn't want them, since the truly wicked would be able to gloat. We're worse. We're truly depraved." I asked, what torments them? Why do they cry so loud and so unremittingly? He answered, I'll tell you quickly. They wish to die but cannot. Their blind lives are so empty, so without reprieve. They envy the nothing that an ending would be. They're not meant to be remembered. Mercy turns her back. Justice disdains them. They're not worth our attention. Look, and then let's go. I caught sight of a banner flitting about so restlessly and moving forward so fast it seemed unable to take a stand. It was followed by a sad and endless train of people racing after. Never had I dreamed death had so many sycophants. I saw some I recognized, and then the ghost of one who'd stood down when faced with doing good and chose instead to be a coward. I knew incontestably this scourge. These despicable cowards were the enemies of both Jekyll and Hyde. They'd never lived and now would never die. Naked as the day they were born, bitter wasps and hornets covered them. Blood trickled between their tears. This sorry, sticky mixture dripped from their chins to their feet and into the mouths of maggots. Farther on beyond these, I saw a crowd gathered on the bank of a wide river. I asked my guide, can you please tell me who these are and why they're waiting with such eagerness to board the boat I can barely make out in the distance? He told me, hush, it will all be clear when we reach the bank of the miserable river Acheron. I was afraid I'd annoyed him by asking, so I stared at my feet and stayed quiet until we reached the river. Then, out of nowhere, there was an old man with white hair coming toward us in a boat, growling, "Give it up, you scum uncles. You'll never see the sky again. Like Red Rover, I'm taking you over to the other side, where you'll eat and drink perpetual darkness. Your naked asses will feel the furnace and the ice. And you, with the beating heart, step away from the dead." When I stood my ground, he said, "You can't get to where you're going from here. You need the dinghy marked P for purgatory. That one leaves from a different pier." Virgil said, "Karen, calm down." We were standing on the ramp. "It's been decided where decisions are made. His passport has a stamp. Now leave it alone." The hairy cheeks of the boatman, king of the river rats, went slack. His fire eyes flared, but he kept silent. The weary and naked ones, however, went ashen and gritted their teeth as soon as they heard his vicious speech. They cursed God, their parents, the human race, the moment of their conception, their father's seed, the space between their mother's legs, and the bed where they were made. Then they moved as one, as if conjoined, sobbing all the while along the evil shore that awaits any and all who fail to fear God. Where demon Charon, his eyes like hollow furnaces filled with fire, herds them together with a nod or beckons with a bent finger, smacking the stragglers with his oar. Fall signals the tree to drop its leaves, and it does, one after the other, until the branch looks down and sees a blanket on the ground. Like that, Adam's wicked children leave the shore, one by one when summoned, the way trained birds come when called with a tin whistle. Then they go over the murky water. Before the boat has landed on the far side, a new group is already huddled naked on the near. "Now," said my teacher, "to your earlier question. The ones you see here have died before making amends. They come from every known country. The reason they're so eager to cross the river is that the desire for divine justice prompts them. The very thing they fear is precisely what they want. The good never board the boat, so if Karen curses both your shoes and the dirt beneath your feet, perhaps you now know why." At that, the pitch-dark plain shook. Every aspect of that moment is burned into my brain. The cold sweat inside my clothes, the hot wind that rose off the ground wet with tears, the massive crimson camera flash that lit the night scene and turned us red. I lost it and dropped, like someone seized by narcoleptic sleep. I'm just checking the time, not my text messages. Okay. The word translation comes into English in the mid-14th century. Removal of a saint's body or relics to a new place, Also, rendering of a text from one language to another comes from the Old French, translation, translation of text, also of the bones of a saint, etc., come directly from Latin, a carrying across, removal, transporting, transfer of meaning. Mistranslation comes much later, 1690s. To render a text from one language to another means to restore or to give back. We get rent from render, meaning payment for the use of property. By 1792, render also meant extracting or melting fat. We get the fat back from the meat. And from 1862, it's also used in visual arts in the sense of reproduction or representation. Perhaps the artist gives back what he or she sees. So translation is giving back what someone said or wrote. But in giving back, one also clarifies or extracts the essence from the original. The clear fat is rendered and clarified when it's heated, and the milk solids that make it cloudy are removed. A gift is carried away and now across and is clarified. The translation clarifies what is being brought over. To clarify is to make known, to make clear, to make brilliant, to free from obscurity. I didn't begin by trying to clarify per se, but instead by trying to make the text as seductive to a contemporary reader as it might have been to a medieval one. To that end, I did several things. I wrote in the vernacular. I would later read that, in fact, Dante wrote in the vernacular, that he refused literary Latin, which would have made great sense, that there were over 25 dialects in Italy, but he chose the Tuscan dialect, and that he said he did this because he wanted the language to change over time, that Latin was frozen in time and would never change. He also said that he wanted everyone to be able to read it, not only those people who knew literary Latin. He also said that he wanted the poem to be written in the language that has heat in it, the same language we use to talk to our family, our lovers, our friends. And so he chose the Tuscan dialect. And it's my understanding that many people learned that dialect in order to read that radical poem, and some other poems that were around that time being written in the vernacular. So the radical nature of it argued that we shouldn't put it in some kind of frozen language. And even that kind of elevated language that some of the translations were embodying in the contemporary era were not the language of the 1300s, so that in fact there was a kind of progression, but why not progress up to the current vernacular? And again, we already had these other translations. So those were my justifications. I wanted this to be as radical. I wanted it to be avant-garde almost. That's what it would have been in its own time. It's hard to imagine the kind of excitement that this poem caused. And so this translation had to be exciting in a new way. I also tried to create a contemporary and expressive music. As I said before, I knew that terza rima in this era would not communicate the way it once did, when it was radical, when it was new. More is lost than is gained in those attempts. Even regular rhyme can be a distraction that results in a loss of gravity. I wanted this translation to have the pathos of the original, the humor, the passion, the horror, and the sense of abiding mystery. When I first read that poem, it wasn't just that I was interested in the various translations that Timothy Donnelly and I were reading. We loved that poem, and that's why you're here, that's why you're in the fan club, is because it's the poem that is so filmic, that is so unusual in the way it maintains this kind of story and the characters in it. I wanted that. And there was a translation in terza rima that had dropped the register And it's by the Italian Kieran Carson, and some of you may know it. It was published by Granta in England and by the New York Review of Books in the States. And it's a wonderful, wonderful tour de force, because in order to push the language into terza rima, he does all kinds of things. And he will go up to that kind of Faust moment, and then he'll drop down and have Dante calling, or Virgil calling Dante a dolt, or a privy overflowing. So it's bouncing up and down the whole time. But I could see that what was going on with that is I wasn't feeling any kind of subjectivity. I was really watching the dance of the translation. I was watching the language, and I didn't want that. I kept asking myself, how could I make someone who wouldn't ordinarily read this poem because they would think it's not for me, plus that rearranging the language into something more colloquial in your brain stops the kind of forward motion that is novelistic in this poem. So that's number 2. 3, I made cultural substitutions. Now, I thought, if I'm going to make this a contemporary sounding poem, why not make it contemporary in other ways? It seemed to me that argument of Dante's of wanting this poem to be continually alive meant that he wanted hell to feel like it was also continually alive. And I know that Dante's Catholic, but I have come to believe that this poem is really not about what might happen after death, but the damage that we do to the social fabric while we're alive, and that was the continual lesson. And that is why that even somebody as relatively benign, he's not ever going to be in the river of boiling blood, Dante, but he also sees himself, so that in the circle with the counterfeiters, he becomes fascinated by bickering that's going back and forth. Somebody hits somebody in the abdomen that's swollen with ascites from kidney disease, from heavy metal poisoning, and he says it sounds like a drum. And then they're very funny the way they're bickering. And then Virgil says to Dante, 5 more minutes of this and I'm going to be very cross with you. And he's mortified because he's called out. And he says, just remember, wherever you go from now on, I'm by your side. And to listen to this kind of thing is unseemly. And it makes me think about reality shows where, relatives come on and they berate each other, embarrass each other, humiliate each other. So I think that those moments in the poem are for Dante to demonstrate for all of us that none of us are above this. He didn't want people reading this poem and saying, well, I'll never go there because I'm good. I'll never, be Attila the Hun and murder people, so I'm safe. I think he wanted us to see what we do to each other, and that these are the kind of object lessons. So there are many cultural moments in the poem, as you know. The annual race in Verona, where the winner walks around all day nude with a bolt of green cloth, and the loser walks around all day nude with a rooster, which I think is probably dangerous if one isn't protected in some way. So I thought, how about I insert some more contemporary cultural references? But I also did not want to tamper with the overall scaffolding of Tuscan history, Greek and Roman mythology, and Catholicism. Otherwise it would become quickly dated if I started putting the current regime in Washington, and it was Bush at that time. And, in 10 years, somebody would say, who's Bush? Already we're almost wishing he were back. So I thought, in those moments where it seems that this isn't somebody who needs to be there because it's a historical figure, I can make a substitution. So for instance, in the Circle of Gluttony, I thought, who is, and commentators have said they've never been able to nail down a particular person. And again, I think it's because we're all gluttons of one sort or another. And so that if we thought it was a historical person, we could say, well, that wasn't me. Whereas if it's just someone from a community, we're all there. So then I thought, well, who's an icon? Who's a signifier of gluttony? And in the Italian, it's a nickname, Giaco, which means piggy. And I thought, okay, and Michael Jackson was alive at that time, and his nickname was Giaco. And I thought, but that's not his sin. That's not his problem, gluttony. So who else? And then I thought of the South Park character, Eric Cartman, who, for a snack, will often have a stack of pancakes with powdered sugar donuts on top. And he's always manipulating people to get things. And so that would be the glutton. And in addition, there were actually 2 episodes where he is called Little Piggy, and in one of those he has to sing a song, I'm a little piggy, oink, 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 I'm a little piggy, oink, oink, oink. So, and someone said, great research, Mary Jo, and it's like, unfortunately, I know every episode. So I made that Cartman, and then he can say in earnestness, and they call me Little Piggy. Other substitutions, there's one prolonged simile where a peasant with a cart wakes up, sees that there's snow outside, dreads getting to his field, and then goes back inside and, paces for a while, wrings his hands, and then goes back out, and the snow has melted. And that simile is to show the great relief, again, where Virgil has indicated some criticism of Dante, and then when Virgil shows that he's no longer angry. So again, this is a moment of great subjectivity. We've all had that relief when somebody's been angry with us, and then we know that that's not going to have destroyed the relationship. And so I thought, well, a peasant with a cart can seem rather quaint. How much personal experience do we have, either being a peasant or having a cart? And then I thought, well, what would be the contemporary equivalent? And I thought, well, it'd be a farm worker, and he or she would go out to the farm or the field with a pickup truck or a tractor. But that would call too much attention to the substitution. So then I thought, well, what's the larger category of farm worker? And it would be worker. And then how would the worker get to work? A car. And the car was even in a cart. So I decided at some point that any substitution I made had to embody the original. So in one point, an arrow comes across something, or a boat comes across as fast as an arrow. And it turned out in that year, the fastest car was an ultimate arrow, A-E-R-O. So I was able to make substitutions that would make hell, our world. That's what speed is to us. That's what anxiety is to us. Who hasn't gone outside, seen the snow, and thought, oh my God, am I going to be able to get to work? And then the relief when either it melts or the snowplow comes through. So I made these cultural substitutions. The other thing is that there are many, I'm checking the time one more time here. There are many poets who are quoted in the work. Virgil himself, Ovid, Lucan. And I think that this is a way of joining in a tradition, a literary tradition, as well as an homage. So I thought if we're going to bring up to the present moment, there would be many other people whom Dante would put into this work. Shakespeare, surely, Milton, maybe Sylvia Plath, maybe Elizabeth Bishop. So if the translation fit exactly, I included a line from a poem, and then a note would give that line. But we also live in a moment where there's a collapse between high culture and low. So I thought, what about low culture poets like songwriters? So there's, for instance, a line from Hotel California by the Eagles. There are 2 lines from Dylan. But again, it had to fit exactly. The other thing was that it had to happen not too often, but often enough. It had to be regular so that when it happened, it couldn't jump out and disrupt your reading or break a mood. So sometimes I would get in the middle of a canto and not have anything by memory, and then I would Google, maybe something was said about pride, and I thought, surely many people have said things about pride, and so pride plus Shakespeare, pride plus Milton, pride plus Plath, and I would inevitably find something, or if not, I'd go to the next moment that I thought talked about a subjectivity that surely people had written about. So I did that, literary references. I also wanted to allow the personalities of characters to manifest themselves. So someone like like Farinata, who is so arrogant that he speaks with a sneer, and he hears Dante walking through the Epicurean cemetery, and he knows he's from Florence by his accent, and so he rises up out of his tomb and says, "So it sounds like you're from Florence. Who were your people?" And Dante says who his people were, and Farinata says, "Yeah, I sent them scattering more than once," meaning sent them into exile. Dante speaks back and says, yes, you did, and then my people sent yours away. But Farinata will not be outdone, and so then he says, "So that's all well and good, but you yourself, personally, are soon going to know the art of exile is hard to master," and of course forewarning him that he will be exiled. So I wanted to allow these personalities to come through as they would in a novel, instead of, again, layering over a kind of language that is dampening all of that down. The other thing I did was I imagined Dante both as a character, and sometimes that was hard. He faints twice, and I thought, how am I going to have a 35-year-old contemporary man so upset that he swoons? I mean, it's so Victorian, right? So those were moments of great challenge, but I tried to make it reasonable. I tried to make it something that I would prepare the reader for, so that it didn't seem, layered over, some kind of false sensitivity. But in time, Dante the character is a very sensitive person. And I wanted all of his actions to be consistent. I also had to learn to imagine Dante the writer. And that was harder, because what do I know about being medieval? What do I know about being a man, a Catholic? What do I know about being in exile, although anyone who's a poet knows something about feeling marginal? But still, how could I know what it was like in any way? But there was one thing we shared, and that was we were poets. And so when I would get into some place I didn't know how to get out of, and there are so many, as you know, so many moments that are actually quite unsettled in the poem. I had no idea until I started reading all the commentary, especially with William Vernon. He'll say, Benvenuto said it meant this, but then so-and-so, and then so-and-so, and then my father, his father was a Dantist, my great father was in Tuscany and talked to so-and-so, the great Dantist, who said only in Tuscany does this word mean bucket. So then it was like I would see more recent translations, and they would not seem to know that fact. So was it just overlooked, or was it unproven? Was it not convincing? So that left things open for me to decide. And again, after exhaustive study, if I still was unsure, I went to being a poet and thought, okay, as a poet, this is what I think you would have meant, or what you meant. So I made a poem. And what is a poem? And no easy answer. Poetry has form, stanzas, sound, phonic echoes, expressive use of sounds, imaginative leaps. I later imagined that in this carrying over that translation is, that what I had to cross was the river of Lethe, because, as you know, that's where the sinful wash, and they forget their sins, and so they're no longer tormented by them. It doesn't mean they forget everything. So if I went through the river of Lethe, I would have to forget my own sins in the errors that I would inevitably make, in misunderstanding, but I would be carrying across the bones of this saint, the skeleton that he left behind. I would be rendering it, making it more clear for a reader who wasn't willing to do the kind of work that you all have done and that I began to do on my own. So to translate and to render, to carry over and to clarify, to give back the gift that's been given to me and to you by Dante. So that's it. Thank you so much. And there are only 3 minutes left of my hour, but if there's one question, I'd be happy to answer it. And I since there are none, I will say in my introduction, I do urge readers to go back to these other translations and read them. I don't think that if you love this poem, that one translation is adequate. Each one has its strengths. Each one has its peculiarities. So anyone who reads mine should read others, and anyone who reads others should read others yet.
Could I ask you to read the worker simile at the beginning of 24 that you alluded to?
Gina asked me if I would read that example of the simile with the peasant, and I will. It's the beginning of Canto 24. Early in the year, when one has a mind of winter and the sun sets its curls under Aquarius and the length of a night is nearly half a day, and frost prints out a picture of its sister as Emily in a white dress with ink that soon vanishes, a worker wakes late for work, goes out to find the street covered with white and chews his lip. He goes back in, grumbles a bit, like we do when we don't know what to do, then goes out again, and now there's hope where it wasn't before. Because that fast, the world has changed its face, and now he gets in the car and goes. When I first saw my teacher's furrowed brow, I felt that anxious, and I felt just that relieved when the wound was suddenly soothed. The moment we reached the ruins of the broken bridge, he turned and gave me a warm look, as when we first met at the foot of the mountain. He pondered the situation, surveyed the heap of broken boulders, then picked me up in his arms.